All right, welcome to the live stream dialogue with Flowersarelovesome. Flowers, thank you so much for joining me today at this very early hour in New York.
It's great to be with you, Chad. Really looking forward to the discussion, yeah.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it a long time. I wanted to formally apologize for waiting until think it's October. No, actually, it's November now in India to do this. I know that you reached out back in June, July, and sorry it's taken this long, but great conversation ahead. In fact, we've been talking already now and have a lot of great things to say. So just decided to maybe just continue what we were already talking about just now with the YouTube audience included.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. And I've been kind of really busy with work and trying to figure out. I have an unusual schedule, so I appreciate you trying to fit me in now. So
yeah, it's been that kind of season, with me as well. Just today being able to finally do this with having the Wi-Fi box and the camera set up. So, but yeah, definitely looking forward to having these discussions because the ideal that I put forth back in June, just sort of anonymously out there, of having a new enlightenment, where the enlightenment, as I mentioned in that video, was more people writing stuff and reading each other's stuff enthusiastically than it was people publishing jobs, right? That's what the Enlightenment sort of morphed into. But at the beginning, it was kind of just, collaboration, and a lot of it was open letters. And I think that that's what we're sort of able to reignite or bring back with dialogues like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this mode of interaction is, it's just a lot more genuine where you are, the goal, the dialogues happening here when they're at their best are about how receptive you can be to another person's thoughts, how receptive you can be to your peers. Whereas, in a more formal situation, it's about, how many things you can get published or what kind of prestige you can accumulate. And so it's just a different tenor. The tenor of these discussions are, I think, they're just refreshing and more genuine, and the motivations are different. So,
not to mention just flat out more interesting.
Flat out what?
Flat out more interesting. Like we could just talk about more stuff here. Then you're going to find the kind of dry sort of discussions you might find in a conference or something. But speaking of those discussions, you had mentioned that you had some general things that you wanted to talk about in response to the What is Science series of videos that I did recently, in which, for maybe viewers who didn't see that series, I kind of say, there's this equivocation where when most people just informally talk about science, they're either talking about nature, right? Which is not, science isn't nature. Okay? Science is a very difficult attempt to talk about nature. Yeah? And they either mean nature, okay, or they mean one particular disputed claim, like this is the sort of PR approach that the media takes, where they say, well, the science peer review has confirmed that fracking is safe, and there's so little risk of environmental disaster that you can't pursue them. And when they say the science backs it up, they really mean one statement within language, and it's the limitation, like it's limited by having to be done in language, like it's limited by having to be done with the budget of people working largely with machines that can extend their, like we can't really do particle research type, particle accelerator research without the particle accelerator, which costs $9 billion. And it's all of those things you never hear about, which I sort of read up, but you did mention that you had some points that you had sort of drafted up. Did you want to maybe give me and the audience kind of a general sort of idea of what you were thinking about this?
Yeah, so, I did, that's exactly where I wanted to begin is, the reasons for this slippage in meaning between all the different ways that we refer to, what we mean when we say science. Science, on the one hand, as, systematized empiricism, science as the cultural institutions that we normally associate with science, the authority of scientists, of academic researchers, and then science as just being like synonymous with solutions, with problem solving, especially solving problems with technology. And then, of course, science as simply the truth. Well, that's, when we say, well, that's science, like you mentioned the Cenk Uygur video of him mocking a pastor, like he means, yeah, synonymous with nature and also just the truth. It's just factual information about reality. And so we have like all this slippage in meaning. And I think that, yeah, that's not a coincidence. I think the reason for that is, because we were talking about it in relation to Kaczynski's concept of the power process, the idea that humans have this basic need for goals that they need to attain through applied effort and, with varying degrees of autonomy. And so I guess I wanted to emphasize, the importance of narrative and, if this is a word, narratological meaning, because that's what I attribute this slippage in meaning to, and the central place that science has taken up in this society, to this need for narrative, for deeper symbolics. And I know I said, in comment on your video that the power process has limited explanatory power, but I think thinking now, I think it's better to say that narrative is the crucial fifth element in the power process, which is that humans and animals have an intrinsic, so the power process is this idea that humans have an intrinsic goal, an intrinsic need for goals which are attainable through effort and with varying degrees of autonomy. I would just say that this fifth element of having a narrative and symbolic meaning is the fifth element, and I think I would give it more weight than the other four elements, because I think that's what distinguishes human sentience from other kinds of animal awareness. I think the power process, as Kaczynski describes it, is necessary but not sufficient.
Would you say, that's a really interesting way of putting it, which I'll admit I have not given its due weight within my discussions about the power process. I fully agree with that. Do you think that it's possible to have the power process as such outside the context of a narrative? And what I mean is it possible to have a position completely outside narrative? And what I mean by that is with the role of characters. And so one thing that makes a narrative different from just processing information is you don't interpret stuff as just raw stuff. You interpret it characterologically, if that's not a real word in the sense of hear political dialogue framed. It's always in the guise of the character roles of the good guys and the bad guys, and the underdog hero who's standing up to these powerful forces. It's very characterological. And do you think that the power process always also works in the context of these characters? For example, yourself. You're interpreting yourself, going through the power process is something like the underdog character who's standing up in the name of virtue against these, forces that represent evil and things like that. I mean, is that kind of what you mean by that?
No, exactly. Yeah, we need to have stories to tell ourselves about ourselves in that kind of way in order to function without, serious psychological consequences. And yeah, I don't think the mere satisfaction of base survival needs is enough to sustain society. It doesn't address. I think even when we act instinctively or impulsively, and just strictly according to animal drives, I think we have to then retroactively couch our actions into a larger narrative. And I think even frivolous activity like mall shopping really couldn't be sustained in the long term as a cultural phenomenon without some kind of belief that it's part of a larger story operating in the rear of our minds. And I actually started to think about this after watching your video on Dune. I actually picked up a copy of the book from the library and to see if I could quickly skim through it and jog my memory. And of course, you can't do that because it's an 800-page doorstop of a book.
Although it is quite a page turner, like it's not a boring.
Yeah.
Like
No.
it's quick.
Yeah. Certainly no. It's definitely not boring, but it is dense. I mean, you have to, it does force you to really think. And the funny thing is, so flipping through it, I landed on the appendix, and I landed on this really interesting quote. So this is from Paul after he becomes the savior of the Fremen. And so it says, religion often partakes of the myth of progress that shields us from the terrors of an unknown future. And I think this is certainly true of science, which is, something like a modern day religion. And you mentioned in that video that, science, that the omnipotence of God has been replaced by science in our day. And so I was kind of thinking along those lines, and also in your response to me on student loans, you talked about the different memes that characterize different civilizations as general kind of shapes. So for modernity, a straight line towards progress. For hunter-gatherers, it's anthropomorphized nature, spirits and gods embodied concretely in natural objects. And then for pre-modern agrarian society, it's the circle, and the concept of cyclical processes and stagnation. And I think those do count. I mean, I may be stretching the definition of narrative, but I do think those count as the kind of narrative that I'm talking about. And so to address that question of can we function without narrative? Actually, I was thinking about this ethnography that I read in 2012 that talks about this tribe, this really interesting tribe, like 300 people in the Amazon, by this anthropologist Daniel Everett. And so from like 30 years of field work with them, he claims that they completely lack any kind of fiction. They lack creation myths and any oral tradition, any tradition of storytelling. And they lack abstractions like number, they lack specific color terms. And the most controversial thing that he claims is that their language lacks what Chomsky considers to be like the universal underlying grammar, the universal grammar that underlies all languages. And the interesting thing about their language is that their grammar embodies something that he calls the immediacy of experience principle. And this is the idea that that really places a value on presence and firsthand experience and things as they appear and disappear in perception. And their grammar actually limits their utterances to claims about what they themselves have experienced or what someone they know has experienced. So it rules out creation myths and even the concept of history. And their cultural memory is limited to one or two generations. But he mentions that despite all this, he mentions that they refer to themselves as straight-headed people and their language straight speech, and other groups, foreign languages, as crooked heads. And so maybe I am stretching the definition of narrative a little bit, but it seems like even that kind of really a culture that seems completely alien to us and that seems to lack anything that we can relate to in terms of narrative, seems that even they have concepts and rituals that are about more than basic needs and that have to do with abstract reflections about their place in the world. And so that's kind of what I mean by narrative. Something like that always has to be in the background, I think, for us to have a functioning culture.
I think it's really interesting, and it's something which I have great questions about the claim that it's a society, it's a culture without narrative. In the sense that even the distinction made here between, we're the straight-headed people and they are the crooked-headed, that's a narratological judgment. In the sense of character judgment that I mentioned, not just interpreting anything as just brute stuff, which I said that's really possible. And also not only interpreting it according to its use, which is we usually do accept this idea that, that's not just a lump of stuff, that's the coffee mug, and we know it is because it's like uses coffee mug. I would take it a step further than that, in the sense that, like, going even beyond that is the narratological interpretation, where it's like, not only am I, a person, I'm also a specific kind of person. I'm a virtuous person, and that's a vile person. The value judgment of that kind, I think, is specific to narrative. You don't get that just from the use of an object, right? And the fact that they're making those judgments indicates to me that there is a narrative. It's the narrative,
right.
Us and them, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. There always has to be this kind of abstract reflection on your place in the world, and also in distinction to others. Yeah, as soon as you have this us versus them, you have some kind of narrative. And so we have this basic narrative that everything from early fire making to drone bombing is like part of the same trajectory of advancement. And I guess for in the modern secular religion of progress, I guess we're all headed towards some kind of like paradise, or for the transhumanists and the technophiles toward like some godlike AI system that subsumes all of humanity into it. And I don't think that's extraneous to the normal functioning of so-called secular society. I think that's fundamental to keeping it afloat. And so, I don't think the problems of today are necessarily that we have this. It's not necessarily science as empirical, mechanistic view. It's the other definition of science as faith in machines as like the de facto solution to all of human problems. And I see the problem of science as the problem of building a culture around things that as you mentioned really preclude everything but one type of one way of perceiving the world. It precludes divergent thought, and it only allows for, as you said, linear ways of thinking.
And the danger, which they were talking about all the way back in like 2002 with the famous article, "Why the Future Doesn't Need Us." The problem of literally handing over all the thinking to the machines, in the sense of any thinking that goes on in this dystopian future is only thinking done by machines, not by people with the aid of machines. That's something different. Okay, like you might have a team of scientists working on a problem, but they use the benefits or the help of machines to do something. It's at this point, where they're proposing to have machines do all of the thinking. And at that point, thought itself has been redefined, because the only kind of thinking that you can do with a machine is the linear thinking rather than the divergent. And although on the surface it looks like there's an exponentially more complicated thought process for such a machine, if you really scratch the surface and look at something like the basic hardware of a computer, there's actually a fairly small number of intrinsic capabilities of something like, the brain of a computer. And if you really look at what these are, there are things which are not only just numerical, but they're actually simple numerical processes. A lot of them, like add 1 to this number, okay? Or set this number to 0, or add these 2 numbers. And I understand, like, you can build lots and lots of fancy stuff, but at the bottom of the whole, tower of abstraction is actually something pretty simple. And to argue that that's what we're all doing, we just don't realize we're just not smart enough to realize that all of our thought is just our brain, plugging into the same small set of really basic operations, like you set that to 0 or increment that by 1. I think is an illusion which is really going to be dangerous, in the sense of just how much are we going to lose if we not only have machines doing that, but we redefine our own thinking. We just set them back.
Yeah, exactly. I was kind of thinking along exactly these lines. Like, I don't think the problem is the worldview itself. I don't think it's having a mechanistic worldview. Like, I don't think we can trace. I don't think there's anything inherently pernicious in the worldview, in the mechanistic worldview, and viewing knowledge as only attainable by, empirically. I think it's then like concretizing this worldview in machines, and then surrounding, building a culture on those machines, because again, machines will preclude other ways of perceiving the world. And so they kind of, it has a momentum of its own that we don't really have control over. And I think that's kind of the critique I really agree with, coming from people like Kaczynski and other people who look at the problem of technology and are critical about science.
Yeah,
I don't think it's, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't even think it's strictly empirical anymore. I think that, like, the empirical metaphor is actually becoming less and less what we're doing as a species, because, like, for example, the Galileo approach of discovering nature's secrets written in the language of math, a lot of that is actually an obsolete way of looking at it now. I think a lot of, like, Mark Zuckerberg and who's another one, Bill Gates, they're not even really interested in that anymore. They're just interested not so much in trying to gain insight into the internal truths, or trying to actually transcendentally penetrate into these internal truths. They're rather just trying to make the machines, invent new ways of doing things, and then sell it back to us for a lot of money. And they've actually become really distant from the empiricist interest with inquiring into something outside of that closed feedback loop of what their machines, what their engineers can do, and then, what they can build on top of that with their machines and their engineers can do, and then selling it to us, right?
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't, yeah, I mean, and yeah, I agree. I mean, I don't think it's, there's something more than an empirical approach to reality is happening here. And yeah, so like, I was thinking about, I was trying to draw a parallel between, like, my own meditation practice and what happens in science, as like the first definition of science is, like, systematically a systematized empiricism. And like, like Buddhist meditation also entails, the cultivation of a really strictly empirical approach to reality, and it also kind of values objective detachment to whatever you're observing. Um, and I also see a parallel, but to the way that um, it tries to reduce reality to manageable bits in a way that's similar to the way that a machine processes data. You're in meditation, you're using language and concepts and labeling instead of numbers to reduce and fragment your experience. But we don't get from that in meditation, we don't get like a totalizing ideology that creeps into every aspect of life and and precludes other ways of perceiving and being. And so I was thinking about, like, you posed the question in your response to Damon D. Could a machine arrive at the works of Aristotle given the input of Plato? And so I kind of immediately restated that question as, in my own terms, as could you arrive at wisdom given the input of all the facts in the world? And I was thinking about what wisdom really is in relation to my own meditation practice. And so I asked myself, could you arrive at the prescription to cultivate compassion, the language of, could you arrive at the language of ethics given the input of Buddhist meditation techniques, which are like all about this cold, detached, objective approach to the world? And so I was thinking really about, the fact that machines only seem to be able to entertain one language, that of mathematics, whereas human consciousness is capable of entertaining multiple languages. And so I kind of reformulated that distinction between linear and divergent thinking along those lines as, wisdom versus the mere accumulation of knowledge, and wisdom being basically wisdom describing the nuanced ways that as humans deal with the ambiguity and the contradictions that are generated by the incongruities between all of the different ways that all the different ways of speaking that we employ, all the different ways that we dress up reality. And so that's kind of what I see as the problem of handing over our thinking to machines, because you don't get wisdom from the mere accumulation of facts. Wisdom, I think, resides in the ways that we deal with ambiguity and contradiction and all of the different ways of speaking.
Right, and the paradox of the Hegel algorithm, for example, as I was talking about with Damon, is you have a system. I mean, you cannot make the charge, as a lot of people would be tempted to. Well, Hegel's not formalizable in this language because that's not a real system. Well, I don't think that fits, because you do have something thoroughly systematic in Hegel that still does not reduce down to the language of once again, a very small handful of actually pretty simple operations like set that to 0, increment that by 1, etc. And I think that something like that might be at work in a lot of maybe meditative and religious systems, much more than I do about, but the experience I had with Buddhism in Thailand, which was a very nice experience I got to have, being sort of ground zero with, what does Buddhism look like for, a people who've been practicing it, I guess, for a very long time, as opposed to, no offense, a lot of Buddhist stuff I saw in Colorado was by recently built operations with recently sort of starting on that trajectory types. And that's perfectly valid in its own way. But it's nice to see like what Buddhism looked like in Thailand for a very established, long established thing. And it seemed to me that Buddhism and Hinduism as well are both things which are kind of like systems. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, although that's merely systematic. I really mean that like Hinduism seems to be a fairly systematic body of knowledge. That's why you have these experts here in India, like the priesthood, for example, who have this vast knowledge of all of these holy texts. So it's systematic, but it is still not the kind of system that could be reduced, maybe, let's say, to the other type of system where we're taking for granted a certain systematic isomorphism in which, we talk about translating one bit of data from one language to another, from natural English to binary code, whatever. But really we talk about whole systems having that isomorphism. You could formalize a system like the U.S. tax code into machine language pretty well, actually, enough that you don't really need people to do it anymore. You don't need accountants so much. You have it totally formalized. But the thing is, like, systems like Hinduism seem to be systems that are not isomorphic to the language of binary digits, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, I mean, would you agree that it's not necessarily the problem isn't necessarily starting with this idea that we can know everything, and that the goal should be, ultimate knowledge, to know the universe in its entirety. Do you think the problem with science is starting from that assumption, or is it something else? Because I kind of see the same tendency in religion. Like, you were talking about Buddhism and Hinduism being, at least the philosophical Buddhism and Hinduism being very systematic. Yeah, they both presuppose a causal, mechanistic universe, and they're striving towards, total knowledge. But I don't see anything inherently pernicious or authoritarian in that approach. I think it's really when you make the decision to embody that into machines.
Yeah, I think something different changes at that point, because machines categorically don't have wisdom. And that's not even something I think you find Ray Kurzweil contradict. Ray Kurzweil, the biggest believer in the hypothesis that everything can be understood by machines. You talk about, people who believe they can understand everything, or the idea, which is very differently spoken of in the Buddhist understanding of everything versus the Ray Kurzweil understanding of, you talk about if you had the set of all facts, which Kurzweil thinks you could pretty well get the robots to compile all of them, right? Could you arrive at wisdom with that's your input? Could you get wisdom as the output? And I think Ray Kurzweil would say that question is not even terribly high on this priority, and because the very idea of finding the wisdom output, let's call it. I don't even think that's a question that Kurzweil would be interested in contemplating, because that kind of knowledge doesn't even seem to be something that they would try to formalize, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I think people like Ray Kurzweil and many other technophiles in general. That's where I locate the problem. They equate the mere accumulation of knowledge with wisdom. They think that, and they also think that these questions, the question you pose, can you derive divergent thought from linear thought, as being irrelevant, because they think that all of these questions, basically everything that the humanities deals with, all of the questions posed by philosophy and politics and even economics, all of that is going to be subsumed by management, by technological management. And so for them, it's irrelevant, because the question of human suffering, all that will disappear with really efficient systems of control, right?
Well, if that was possible, I would argue it should have already happened, because when you hear someone like Ray Kurzweil say, "Look, there's going to be this exponential leap," it's like, no, there's already in a vast exponential leap in all of these systems, in the past however many years, since like the 1990s especially. But I remember, from having okay, your exponential leap already happened, and you've got more trouble, I'll just call it that, than today than you did before that happened. So the idea that we just need the exponential leap to happen for peace of mind to be achieved by the world, I would argue if it was possible, it already would have happened. Right?
Yeah, and it's also kind of troubling that they think that basically the solution is, the singularity is not a conscious choice. It's not something that we arrive at through, careful deliberation. It's not through wisdom. It's basically just an inevitability. It's just the function of the exponential growth of technology.
Well,
so
when you say, when you say the exponential growth of technology, what you actually mean, I'm addressing this occurs well. What he actually means by that is the exponential increase in the burning of fossil fuels and the exponential increase of debt. Okay, and you can do that, but those both have very serious limits.
Right. But so I did want to pose this question to you. If we were to assume, if we were to take that given, of the presupposition of the continued burning of fossil fuels as a given, what would your critique be of that of that worldview?
Like
let's say, no. So go ahead. So what? Let's say we took that as a given. For me, I would still, I guess, from my perspective, I would still see that as a problem, because I see the problems that the humanities are addressing as something fundamentally different, and that can't be subsumed by efficient management.
Yeah, I would say, a couple things, I guess. First of all, what would I say to the idea of exponential burning of fossil fuels, and by the way, exponential increases in debt? Because something which, if you saw my video, well, anytime that I talk about Dmitry Orlov, not necessarily just when I get on him, Dmitry Orlov, as an engineer and a very good sort of guy, said that if you take an honest numerical look at the data, you can't not see collapse coming, for the simple fact that at this point, the US dollar is simply a synonym for not just debt, but ever-increasing debt, and not just ever-increasing debt, but ever-exponentially increasing debt. And he mentioned that things that are taken for granted today, like shipping goods from China, well, let's start it here. You have open-pit mining in the Congo in Africa, and then that's shipped to China to produce these technological gadgets, and then that's shipped to Los Angeles, and then that's shipped from there to Minnesota, and all of that shipping we take for granted as the only way you could do anything. And its intrinsic cost is really astronomical, and it's actually so expensive to ship that stuff all over the world that the only way it goes on is with debt. Okay, so if there was no more extended debt in that system of international trade tomorrow, the shops in America, the shelves of Walmart would go bare with utilities. And the only thing keeping an intrinsically very expensive system functioning is that the Ponzi scheme of the financial system allows continued exponential debt increases. But that has a limit, okay? And it's not just the fossil fuels, which are deeply limited. It's also the financial limits, which they've been pretty good at, bullshitting their way around those limits, but it won't go on forever. And, you're going to see a vastly different future, I think, when all of this starts to catch up. It will no longer be a given that you can just ship fruit from Chile to North America in the middle of winter just so Gary can put it on a Sunday, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I guess I'm trying to ask you, what would your critique be if we didn't have these limitations? Like, if we didn't have the problem of debt, if they could achieve more and more the kind of exponential growth that they foresee happening without debt and without limited resources, if they had access to unlimited energy, what would then your critique be?
Well, I try to avoid Marxist tropes if at all possible. Yeah, so you notice on the channel I very, very rarely use anything from Marxism. But one thing that Marx did get right about capitalism, it's intrinsically exploitative. So he doesn't mean it's just morally exploitative or it's just morally dehumanizing. He means, no, you actually generate profit in capitalism by paying your worker less than they're worth and then selling products for more than they're worth. And the difference, the surplus value, that's where you generate profit. And I would argue that, as true as that was in 19th century Germany at a factory, it's even more true with fossil fuels and debt. The kind of society you're asking for, if you run your society on the philosophy of debt and fossil fuels, if you're asking for a kind of society. The Bernie Sanders people can say, we've got this government program to get around the inequality, but they won't get away from the debt and the fossil fuels, which is why the Bernie Sanders movement, even if they had gotten the presidency, no offense to the people watching, you would not have gotten your equal society, because if you have a society with debt and fossil fuels as the very presupposition, and I would argue with technological automation as your presupposition, you're going to get an unequal society. The reason is usury fundamentally enacts the transfer of wealth from productive sectors of society to unproductive sectors of society that results in a real transfer of access to goods and services. If I pay Sallie Mae for a student loan for $100,000, regardless of anything else, there's a very real inequality generated by that, where Sallie Mae's executives, it's just a priori given access to more stuff within the economy than me. Okay? And that is the result of running a society on debt. If you have fossil fuels, you're also generating inequality a priori, because the working class will lose their jobs in favor of machines or sweatshops in Indonesia, and the ability to have cheap shoes made in Indonesia and then shipped to Los Angeles and then shipped to Minnesota to a Walmart is something that you might lament as the decision of, evil executives. But it's really what you get from holding up your end of the deal to live in a fossil fuel society. Technological automation is the other big thing. If you support the advancement of putting computers in places that quite frankly just don't belong, which is the situation we've reached now, where you can't even buy bus fare in Sweden without a credit card. Like, it's not even just a credit card, you need a text message. So in Sweden right now, you can't even get on a bus without buying a bus fare with this. And they try to bring this bullshit to universities now, where you can't even walk into class without a cell phone. I remember being at the University of Illinois, which is supposed to be like the 5th best computer school in the world or something like that. And I was trying to clock into orientation for TA training for grad students. We were all trying to clock in, and we couldn't, because you might have like one of the fastest supercomputers in the world or something on campus, and they can't get something as simple as that right, but they still try, because they can't just pass a piece of paper around. They have this self-consciousness. We can't look that primitive. We have to have this fancy system. And I would argue, if you choose to live in a world and a country with fossil fuels, debt, and technological automation, you're choosing to live in an unequal society, because all three of those a priori generate inequality. Now, to get to the question you asked about, where does that leave philosophy? I would say this. The reason I spent so much time just now talking about the inevitable inequality, which is not just the result from Donald Trump being president any more than it was a result of just Barack Obama being president, whichever side of that divide you happen to live on, is that by living in an a priori unequal society, you have this rare opportunity for a certain power vacuum to pop up in the underclass of society, who will not have their interests mentioned by CNN, the New York Times, let alone the politicians and CEOs, the Mark Zuckerberg towards Bill Gates, they'll never speak anything except their own ideology, which is that, philosophy is a waste of time because we have to do our thinking. What you'll find with that power vacuum is more and more turning to avant-garde ways of consciousness tapping into its abilities in the form of magic. And actually, John Michael Greer did a recent set of posts about the unspeakable role of magic, and he means that literally in things like the election of Trump, which I just refer you to look at that. The curse, for example, put on Hillary Clinton to collapse in public, which resulted in Hillary Clinton collapsing in public, for one example. But I think that magic, if you just not only talk about like people actually getting into people, but I would largely consider a lot of old religious practices to be magic. As somebody who was raised in Roman Catholicism, I know that when you've got the incense and you've got the chanting in Latin and you've got the symbols flashing over and over again of Jesus on the cross and the Virgin Mary and this and the stigmata. I know magic from my own experience of living with it as a child in a pretty traditionalist Roman Catholic household. Like my father and all that. They were not, like watered down Catholics. Like I was raised in a pretty. I was raised with a lot of exposure to real magic, is what I will say. And I think that the point you made in your video about Buddhism being something, or Hindu meditation, both of them being things you should try at your own risk, because there could be very surprising results from them, I think is another type of delving into magic that more and more people in undersized society are going to start getting into, right?
Oh, yeah. That's interesting. I think you define magic as will changes in consciousness. Or maybe you're borrowing from John Michael Greer, right?
Exactly. That's the definition of magic. And the fallacy of magic is thinking that you can enact changes in physical matter and apply on that. And that's not magic. The rule of thumb is the more you think that that's magic, the less you actually know about it.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that. Directing. I think it's. I think that's a good thing in some ways, like directing that need for the thing that we talked about, the power process and the desire to make sense of the world. Directing that inward is a good thing. But I'm also trying to, I guess, build. Like, I'm deeply unsatisfied with actually my own traditions. I'm kind of deeply dissatisfied with how uncritical they've been, especially in modern times. Like a lot of meditation centers and even really traditional monasteries and centers of religion, they kind of just serve like a civic function in society. They at best they serve a civic function. At worst, they're just commercialized, just another thing. They just provide like palliatives for living in a context for which humans are really maladapted for. And so my kind of goal in talking about religion, especially the traditions that I'm interested in, is I guess trying to first synthesize something that's deeply personal for me, as magic in the way that you defined it as will changes in consciousness, but also something that's takes a more critical position than I've seen from especially a lot of Vedanta centers. You'll see a lot of monks going to universities and IT institutions and giving lectures. Yeah, I'm really troubled by the civic function that these religions largely take on. I wish they would take a more critical approach and be a little bit more critical of modernity along the lines that you articulate so well on your channel.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that if you do find it being used for those purposes, it's going to be the underground. And the idea of a public sort of mainstream temple or church or whatever engaging in really critical work. I don't think that that's something that you would see in a situation like ours. The idea is that if the really unspeakable, delving into critique of the way we do things is going to happen at all, it's going to be in the underground. And I think that we're going to see more and more of that as time goes on.
Yeah, and in the form of, I think, these discussions, these kinds of informal interactions will be a large part of that. That's why I'm so excited about your work and your approach to this. I mean, I do see this as kind of first, what learning could look like without all the trappings of more formal situations, and also kind of subverting the already existing ways of doing things, in academia and also in religious institutions, because you also talk about a lot of the same things that people like me who are interested in religion talk about, and who see like a critical kernel in religion, especially in like their monastic traditions. But that, I don't see that present in elsewhere, really. So
I mean, and first of all, thanks. I think that, this is work which I kind of resisted doing for a long time. I was off YouTube for 3.5 years. I was in the news this week. I never would have been in the news a year ago. Just a year ago, I really wanted to just be off the grid. Like a year ago, I didn't have a cell phone. I deactivated my social media. I had no YouTube channel. I just really a year ago wanted to be a simple medical courier there in Denver, with my library card, reading my Barterman and my Robert M. Price, and just live a very simple existence. And I changed my mind about that earlier this year. I decided to come back to, I guess, maybe having a public voice, although definitely, it's not the same sort of public voice I tried to have back in 2012 when I was in graduate school. I'm really operating not only outside the academy, but I'm willing to say things that nobody in the academy who's a PhD candidate hoping to get a job in an R1 institution or anywhere. Actually, at this point, it's a huge thing to get a job anywhere. I've personally seen PhDs from Harvard who don't get any sort of academic job after they get out. So at this point, people are so desperate to get a job anywhere that they're just absolutely terrified, and I would argue they're just completely deprived of the ability to be themselves, and they'll spend their whole lives doing that the longer they try to chase it. But we're doing thinking in a way that they would consider unthinkable, because we're not only not going through an academic conference right now, but we're actually willing to say things which nobody who's trying to keep their job at an R1 institution would ever say, right?
Yeah, and can you imagine? I mean, we cite such a wide range of authors and ideas, many of which are really, really controversial or just outright dismissed, because they're not already in the academy.
Right, you're not going to see a professor, teaching a course on the philosophy of Ted Kaczynski, right?
Right, or even John Michael Greer, or any of these.
That, Wikipedia actually purged John Michael Greer. You may not have noticed his Wikipedia page back in like 2011, for example. He had a Wikipedia page like 7 years ago or something, and Wikipedia purged him. And someone asked him on his blog, why did Wikipedia remove him? He said it was part of a coordinated effort to purge Wikipedia of occultists and underground thinkers. Okay, so just removed all of them. And what that means is they were trying to basically make them non-existent. So my village in India is so obscure it doesn't have a Wikipedia page. Okay? That's a test. Right, that's a test of how obscure you are. If you're not on Wikipedia, you know,
You don't exist.
You don't exist. Yeah, it's like 1984, right? The people in 1984 who there's no notice, there's no obituary for them in the newspaper because they never existed. They just disappeared. And, Wikipedia can do that. Facebook can purge Alex Jones, not listing Alex Jones as a great intellectual. I'm just saying that these companies, when they want to sort of purge something from existing, they have the power, I guess, to remove them from some electronic system. But, the thinking is going to go on nonetheless. And if I'm ever, not able to keep doing YouTube, I'm just still going to write books. You're never going to stop me from thinking, regardless of how illegitimate it might look to somebody with a research grant from an R1 institution, to write a book. And I'm just there in the jungle writing a book on Google Docs, right?
Yeah. I mean, your reasons for staying away from the academy kind of remind me, of my reasons for, I'm deeply invested in researching, Hinduism and Buddhism, and I thought about actually just joining a monastery. That's how serious I've been about it. But I'm just deeply dissatisfied with the positions and the roles that monasteries and religious institutions have taken. And you simply can't be as critical in those contexts. You can't cite, you can't talk about Kaczynski and John Michael Greer and also try to synthesize this stuff and let it creep into the official doctrine. It seems like as soon as you step into a formal situation, part of what you do becomes a large part of what you do is just defending the institution, apologizing for the institution itself, rather than dedicating yourself to the ideas. And so that's why it's kind of nice to be, these floating heads talking with each other, because there's more seriousness. There's more, we're more attuned to the ideas themselves. And we don't have to worry about the politics of and the internal dynamics of this or that institution. So,
and also, what you gain from being at the institution. I say this is somebody who was, I was in graduate school and I wrote a master's thesis, and I technically had an academic publication, and I presented in graduate seminars, which are basically de facto academic conferences, and I have taught. And this many years later, the number of people that any of that still affects is probably this much. Honestly, the couple of years I spent in academia, at this point, it doesn't affect anyone. Okay? If I presented in an academic seminar for 5 people present, not a one of them remembered the word I said the next day, I'm sure, let alone this many years later. And, the thing is, Kaczynski did the same thing. He had an academic career. He had a doctoral dissertation, which they say 10 people could understand. I've looked up his doctoral dissertation. I admit I'm not one of those 10 people. It's very difficult stuff that he was writing about. He's obviously a very gifted person, but, how much, if he had just dropped out of, Berkeley and gone off to live, if he hadn't become a Unabomber, how much would anybody know about his academic work now?
Yeah, nothing. It's unfortunate that he had to go to the lengths that he did to get his ideas out there. But
academic work from the 70s, especially, even if you really, really want to find it, you can. One of my professors, who was a Chomsky scholar, one of the smartest guys I ever met, right? I got a hold of his doctoral dissertation some years ago through interlibrary loan from the University of Kansas, where it's been sitting since the 70s. But even today, I can't find him on Google. I wanted to just look up this doctoral dissertation again. He's actually not even in the archives of anything on Google anymore. So it's one of those things where even if you really want to find some of this stuff, you simply can't. So I don't think anybody should have illusions about how much more significant, you might be able to make a contribution if you were working for these institutions. It's really the other way around.
Yeah. You just got me thinking about the fact that another problem with this kind of this situation that we have today is, if it's not registered in some kind of, it's funny.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So it's kind of strange. Like, now we're in a situation where if you've written a book, if you've written something that,
go ahead, dude.
oh yeah, if you've written a book, if you've put something concrete and lasting out there, unless it's registered in all of these new forms of media, unless it's documented in things that are really, as you've pointed out many times, really fragile systems and ephemeral systems in the long term, you don't exist. Like, it's really strange. And more, if you don't have social media, you don't exist. Like, you have no inner life without being an exhibitionist online. It's like you have no substance to you.
But how much stuff on social media doesn't exist anymore? Like, I was using MySpace in 2006.
Right.
Okay. And, I wanted to log into MySpace to find some old, photos or something, and I wasn't able to anymore, just in like 2012. And, somebody got into all of the passwords of MySpace. There was a massive breach. And I mentioned this to one guy, and he said, well, they should tell me what my password is, because I don't even remember.
Yeah.
So the thing is, like, we might think at the moment that something on Facebook that's viral, you see these people make big mistakes where they say something stupid on Twitter, and it gets reshared and reshared and reshared until the death threats come in, and then they have to go into hiding, and then they have to they get fired from their job, and then they're contemplating suicide. And it's this ridiculous way that something that seems invincible, like a tweet about something stupid, that it can never go away. It's actually few things in life are as ephemeral as that. It's going to be completely non-existent, even at the point that Twitter decides to stop archiving it. And I think that the test of whether something survives into the future, like you're talking about, writing a book outside of the academy, but the test of whether something survives in the future is whether anyone cares about it. And I'll give you an example of, like John Michael's blog, when he was announcing he was taking it down. One of my old friends from undergrad decided to personally go back and save every one of the posts to his computer, and as something of almost like the first activity of like a monk preserving important texts for the future. And there's so many blogs and so many official academic publications, by the way, that you wouldn't have had people enthusiastic enough to do that, right?
Yeah. I've been thinking about that a lot. What, to put it in your words, what doesn't, I've been thinking a lot about that in terms of like music too. Like, what doesn't presuppose the burning of fossil fuels? What kind of music will persist in the future? And it's going to be acoustic. It's not going to be electronic. That only electronic music, as great as it is, it only speaks to a world that's swimming in machines, and it's not going to speak to it's not even going to be around. But even if it were, it's not going to speak to a world that's not completely mediated by technology.
And I think that, when we talk about losing electronic music, certainly outside America, there's even more the case that you have like this sort of electronic, like, what's the word, like this dance sort of like nightclub music, right? Is a big thing, even more so outside America, I think. And when we talk about going from that, which is just totally artificial, down to acoustic music like John Denver or something like the folk music of Jeff Ritol on an acoustic guitar, for example, we might think, not you, but people might think naively that you're going to drop down in impact, but it's actually the other way around. If you've ever been to a performance of like a symphony orchestra, you'll realize just how much more you can get in actually sitting in a room with that many instruments playing at the same time, and just how little of that gets captured on like somebody's playing Beethoven on their iPhone, like with a little speaker on their iPhone, like a YouTube video. I mean, that's cool, but that's nothing like actually sitting in a room with that many instruments, right?
Yeah, and it's directing, and there's a whole another world of sensory experience when you're actually in an auditorium. There's the physical aspect of it too, like you get to feel the bass, you get to feel the drums, the actual physical vibrations of it, and also being surrounded by your peers. It's a completely different experience than getting it through the years. And yeah, it's a complete reduction of that to ones and zeros.
Yeah, but quite frankly, and also the idea of participation, because one thing you'll notice if you look at really old accounts of music is now we sort of have a presumption that music is this thing that comes out of your iPod, goes through headphones, and goes into your ear like this. But music is something which, if you even like Lord of the Rings, if you read the Lord of the Rings, you'll see that the hobbits kind of go through the woods singing songs to pass the time. Barbershop quartets, most people don't know, is a reference to the way that people used to sing songs while they were waiting to get their hair cut at the barber if they were standing in line. These days, people just stand in line and do this, scroll down. But in those days, they would actually grab a hymnal basically, and they would sing. And music is something you did rather than just listen to. I think was something we lost. I think a lot of people feel like you have these, you have instant access to a violin virtuoso, best in the world, whatever. So why should you even try? I think a lot of people are missing out on just like, even if you're not a great musician, like, I'll admit, man, you're a much better guitarist than me. I'm not a great musician, but I enjoy it, And a lot of people, like, you could be like a not so great musician like me, but if you enjoy it, you still get to have that experience.
Especially in what you lose when you go from the live performance to the audio recording is, I don't think people realize how much of like sitting in a chair, sitting on your butt and listening to a pianist on stage is not actually that. It's not passive in the way that getting it from your earbuds is. There's so much nonverbal communication that goes into an interaction between the crowd and the musician that goes into his performance or her performance. That's really lost in the audio recording, and it's also, and even if you record a lot, you make a live recording, that experience you're never going to get. You're never going to reproduce that through a digital recording.
Well, also, how many people do you think who, take out their phone and get on YouTube and say, like, oh, give me, like, a full performance of Beethoven's Symphony of this way? How many people actually listen to the whole thing? We have this crisis where most people are used to 3-minute YouTube music videos, and even something like Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, somebody said if it was released today, people would go to iTunes and they would download like Breathe and Money and Time, and that would be it. And they would miss what that album actually was as a full 40-minute long, basically interconnected piece, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. The whole context of the work, in the context of the context of a piece in terms of the album, but also in terms of the larger. People no longer follow bands either. They don't follow composers. They don't trace their evolution really. They just pick up songs. They create mixtapes and playlists. Yeah.
And this music is incredibly short-lived because if you really scratch the surface, something that's like a sort of upbeat hit in 2012, it sounds old worn out and cliche within like 6 months. And then next year they'll come out with something with the exact same formula, which will get like millions and millions of, purchases on iTunes. And it's going to be just as worn out 6 months later. The cycle just stays on and on and on, right?
Yep. Yeah, that's why I appreciate that's one of the few things that I appreciate about living in New York, is this place does really value live music and in smaller venues, and there's a real emphasis on going to see a little and following a band, and really trying to understand what the author is getting at through live experiences. So that is one thing I really appreciate about being here.
Yeah, I think it's going to go on too. Even if there's no fossil fuels, you're going to see the great sort of jazz quartets performing live. It's good to know that sort of thing, it will go on regardless of whether there's fossil fuels.
Yep.
Well, man, I sorry to say, but I think I better get my wife back home. It's been a great talk with you, and I appreciate your time. And I'll go ahead and just say right now that, if you're interested in joining me for another dialogue sometime, I'd be very happy to continue this discussion and all that another time. So thanks a lot for joining me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. I look forward to speaking with you again, and I hope to create more video responses to you, make this a little bit more structured, and in addition to these kinds of dialogues. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
That sounds great. All right, man. We'll see you the next time.
All right. See you.